In 465 BCE, a woman was dragged into the courtyard of the most magnificent palace on earth. And what happened next was so brutal that even the hardened soldiers who witnessed it couldn't speak of it without trembling. For her crime was simply saying no to the wrong man. But here is what makes this story truly horrifying. This wasn't an isolated incident, but rather just one day in the Persian royal court. One crime in a decades-long pattern that turned the world's most beautiful palace into a chamber of psychological torture. And the man responsible, King Xerxes I of Persia, is someone whose name you know and whose armies you've seen in movies. Yet you have no idea what he really was, because history wants you to remember him as a warrior, as the man who led millions against Greece, and as the builder of monuments that defied imagination, which is the story we tell ourselves because it's easier to digest. But behind those golden walls, a different war was being fought. One without swords or shields, where the victims couldn't run, couldn't fight back, and couldn't even speak their truth without risking everything they loved, raising the terrifying question of whether the greatest atrocity of Xerxes' reign had nothing to do with Greece, but was happening right under his own roof every single day to the people who should have been safest in his presence. To understand why this story was buried for over 2,000 years, we must start with a question historians rarely ask. What does it actually do to a human being when everyone around them insists they're not human at all? In October 486 BCE, in the throne room of Persepolis, a 36-year-old man named Xerxes receives the crown of the largest empire the world has ever seen, following the death of his father, Darius the Great. And from this moment forward, Xerxes will never again experience a single genuine human interaction, because every person who approaches him must follow an elaborate ritual called proskynesis, falling face down on the ground and kissing the earth before him, not bowing, not kneeling, but completely prostrating themselves as if before a deity. And no one can turn their back to him, ever, for to do so is death. Nor can anyone look directly into his eyes unless given explicit permission, nor speak unless spoken to first. The Greek historian Herodotus recorded something chilling about Persian court protocol, noting that if you had to approach the king with urgent news, you first had to stand outside the throne room for days, sometimes weeks, waiting for permission to enter. So even if the empire was burning or cities were falling, you waited, because disturbing the god king at the wrong moment could cost you your head. But what makes this truly insidious is that Xerxes wasn't born believing he was divine. He was systematically conditioned into it by his mother, Atassa, who understood power better than anyone alive as the daughter of Cyrus the Great, the empire's founder, having watched her own family tear itself apart in succession wars, seeing brothers poison brothers and entire bloodlines erased overnight, leading her to teach her son a lesson that would poison everything he touched. Trust nothing, control everything, and show no weakness, because the moment you're seen as human or vulnerable, you're already dead. Greek sources tell us Atassa had enormous influence over Xerxes, creating not a king, but something far more dangerous, a man who genuinely believed that other human beings existed only as extensions of his will. A belief system that unfolded within the royal household itself, which Hollywood gets spectacularly wrong by picturing ancient Persian kings in an eternal bachelor party of absolute indulgence, when the reality was far more complex and disturbing. Because the Persian royal household, called the Anderun, was a sophisticated political institution where Xerxes appears to have been married to only one woman throughout his entire adult life, Queen Amestris. This wasn't a harem of disposable women, but a system where Amestris was a permanent fixture of immense power, who owned vast estates, commanded her own household troops, held audiences with foreign dignitaries, and even controlled major construction projects. Yet all of that power existed at Xerxes' pleasure and could be stripped away with a single word, making the royal household home to the most powerful women in the empire, the king's mother, wife, sisters, daughters, and relatives, who lived in unimaginable luxury, wearing robes worth entire cities and dining on delicacies from every corner of the world, attended by hundreds of servants. Yet they were also prisoners.
If you believe in God, then like and subscribe. Back to the story.
The Greek physician Ctesias, who served at the Persian court, described the women's quarters as sealed off from the outside world by massive walls and locked gates, where male visitors were forbidden entirely except for the king and a small number of eunuchs, meaning the women could look out from high windows at the city below and hear the sounds of life, but couldn't participate in it, possessing everything except agency over their own existence, a situation made more horrifying because it wasn't seen as oppression but as honor and protection, a cage the women were raised to see as a palace, and isolation they viewed as intimacy with divinity, which is what makes systemic control so insidious as the victims internalize and defend it. For decades, this system functioned exactly as designed, with official records speaking only of order and prosperity, until something went catastrophically wrong in the late 470s BCE, after Xerxes returned from the disastrous Greek campaign in humiliation and developed an obsession with the wife of his own brother, Mesistes. This woman, whose name history didn't preserve, was married to one of the king's most powerful military commanders and was living a relatively normal life within royal constraints when Xerxes approached her, made advances, and made promises, but she did the unthinkable. She looked the most powerful man on earth in the eye and said no. For most men, that would have been the end, but Xerxes' conditioning had taught him that his desires were cosmic imperatives, and resistance was a disorder in the universe. So instead of giving up, he shifted his focus to her daughter, Artante, who was his own niece and probably in her late teens, and unlike her mother, she didn't have the strength to refuse, starting an affair where Xerxes, needing to prove his control and hurt the mother who rejected him, promised Artante anything she wanted in the empire. Artante, perhaps manipulated or genuinely desiring it, asked for a magnificent, one-of-a-kind robe personally woven by Queen Amestris herself, a symbol of the queen's status, and Xerxes, knowing exactly what he was doing, gave it to her, a deliberate and calculated insult that he knew would provoke Amestris, because absolute power inverts empathy, turning the suffering of others into entertainment and conflict into sport. When Queen Amestris saw her robe on Artante, she understood immediately and planned her response with cold precision, not targeting Artante, but targeting Artante's mother, the innocent woman who had refused Xerxes in the first place, waiting for the king's birthday celebration, a massive feast where Persian custom dictated the king must grant any request, to publicly ask for the wife of Mesistes to be delivered to her as a gift. Xerxes, understanding the implication, begged Amestris to choose cities or armies instead, but he was bound by the public nature of the request, and the woman was delivered to the queen's custody, where she was mutilated in ways specifically designed to destroy everything that made her a person, having her breasts cut off and her nose, ears, lips, and tongue removed before being sent back to her husband in this condition as a message. And let me be absolutely clear that this is one of the most horrifying acts of cruelty recorded from the ancient world, almost impossible to process in its level of sadism, but we need to understand the psychology behind it, because Amestris wasn't just punishing a rival, she was making a statement about power in the royal household, declaring that her authority in this domain was absolute, and that anyone who became an object of the king's desire, even unwillingly, would be destroyed so completely that they would serve as a warning for generations. There is another layer here that is even more disturbing, because by targeting the mother instead of the daughter, Amestris was punishing the woman for her virtue, for her refusal, and for her loyalty to her husband, sending the message that she should have submitted, and that her dignity, her moral code, and her resistance were not virtues in this court, but schemes, leading the woman's husband, Mesistes, to respond exactly as you would expect, with absolute rage, gathering his forces to attempt a rebellion against his own brother. Yet the revolt was crushed, and Mesistes and his entire family, sons, daughters, everyone, were hunted down and executed, erasing the woman who said no, the daughter who couldn't say no, and an entire bloodline, all because one man believed his desires were divine imperatives. This leads to the question historians hate but must ask: was this an isolated incident or a window into something much darker? The problem is that Persian royal records were designed to project divine order, recording military victories and religious devotion while ignoring palace scandals and family conflicts, especially anything that would humanize or criticize the king, leaving us with fragments and Greek sources that might be biased. Yet the historical record shows that after Greece, Xerxes essentially withdrew from public life, stopping his military campaigns and travels to retreat into his palaces at Persepolis, where he spent the last years of his reign focused on building projects and private pursuits, while the court became increasingly isolated, and his sons grew up watching their father's paranoia intensify. The power of court officials like Artabanus, the commander of the royal bodyguard, expanded dramatically, suggesting that the system had consumed even the man at its center, turning Xerxes into a prisoner of his own absolute power who couldn't trust anyone, couldn't form genuine relationships, and couldn't even be certain his own sons wouldn't murder him, which was a perfectly reasonable fear because on August 465 BCE, in the palace at Persepolis at midnight, King Xerxes I, ruler of the largest empire in human history, was murdered in his own bed. The most dramatic version of the story tells us that Artabanus, the man whose entire job was protecting the king, led the conspiracy and entered the private chambers to kill him while he slept. But Artabanus didn't stop there, executing a plan so cunning and psychologically sophisticated that it reveals just how deeply dysfunction had penetrated the royal family, by going to Xerxes' younger son, Artaxerxes, and telling him that his older brother, Crown Prince Darius, had just murdered their father, presenting false evidence to manipulate the young prince's grief and rage until Artaxerxes executed his own brother to avenge their father, only realizing later when Artabanus tried to consolidate power that he had been manipulated into fratricide, leading him to have Artabanus and all his co-conspirators hunted down and killed. Think about what this story tells us. The king's own bodyguard murdered him, and the king's own son murdered his brother, all within the most heavily guarded palace in the ancient world, proving that the entire system was completely broken, and the culture of fear and paranoia had spread so thoroughly that even the inner circle saw assassination as the only path to survival, meaning the walls Xerxes spent his life building didn't protect him, but trapped him. For the women of the royal household, the death of King Xerxes changed nothing, because Artaxerxes I inherited the throne and the system, continuing the practice of viewing royal women as political assets, the isolation, the control, and the reduction of human beings to instruments of dynastic power, which actually intensified as Artaxerxes' own son, the future Darius III, married his half-sister Persepolis in a union specifically designed to consolidate power, a practice of sibling marriage that became more common in later generations until Alexander the Great burned Persepolis to the ground. The system persisted for a century and a half, with generations of women born, living, and dying within those walls, never knowing any other reality. And the truly chilling part is that this wasn't seen as tragedy, but as civilization and order, blessed by priests and defended by the women who suffered through it because they had been taught from birth that this was honor, not horror, which is what systemic oppression looks like at its most effective, when the victims can't even recognize their own oppression, and when the cage is so beautiful that you forget it is a cage at all. The ruins of Persepolis stand today in the Iranian desert, with their columns reaching toward the sky like broken fingers, and while tourists walk through them imagining the glory that once was, those stones remember different things, remembering the women whose names weren't recorded, the voices that weren't heard, and the lives that were lived entirely at someone else's pleasure, making the story of Xerxes' household not just ancient history, but a warning that echoes across every century and civilization, showing us what happens when we build systems that place any human being beyond accountability, confuse power with divinity, and convince ourselves that some people are born to rule while others are born to serve. For while the palace is ruins now and the empire is dust, the lesson remains that absolute power doesn't just corrupt the person who holds it, but corrupts everyone who participates in maintaining it, twisting love into control, duty into fear, and human beings into instruments, which is not just ancient history, but something happening right now somewhere in the world behind walls we can't see.
To truly understand the permanence of this scar on human history,
we must look beyond the immediate aftermath of Xerxes' murder and witness how the poison he injected into the empire's